Blake barely managed to step through the front door. His body felt heavy with exhaustion after yet another grueling day. His hands were calloused, and his head ached. As a construction project manager, his job revolved around solving problems, but once those problems were addressed, he often lent his strength to carpentry work. His home was his sanctuary, his happy place. However, as soon as he stepped inside, he realized something was off. A suitcase stood by the door. Blake froze in place. Then his gaze fell on Susan. She was sitting on the edge of the couch, her posture unusually straight, and her expression far brighter than it should have been. "Don't worry," Susan said in an exaggeratedly cheerful voice. "I'm not leaving you." Blake blinked, trying to gather his thoughts. His silence was instinctive. Years of experience had taught him to keep his mouth shut and listen when situations grew tense, and his intuition told him this was one of those moments. Feeling disoriented and with a growing sense that something terrible was happening, he tossed his keys onto the side table. "I just wanted to handle this first," Susan continued, standing up. Her nervous energy revealed itself in her movements. She smiled, wide, even excited, but there was something off about it. It was too forced. "This is going to sound, well, bad at first, but I have to tell you." Blake's gaze darted to the suitcase, and his mind began piecing together facts he didn't want to acknowledge. "What's going on?" he finally asked, his voice hoarse with fatigue and confusion. Susan took a deep breath, like someone preparing to share good news. "I'm going away for a week," she said with excessive enthusiasm. "With Roger." For a moment, silence blanketed the room. Blake stood there, as if his body had forgotten how to move or react. Roger? Her boss. The arrogant jerk who always seemed to think everyone else was beneath him. That Roger? "You're leaving, with Roger," Blake said in a steady tone. It wasn't a question, nor a statement. It was more like a simple acknowledgement of what he had just understood from the conversation. Susan hurried to continue, a mixture of guilt and excitement evident in her demeanor. "I know. I know. At first, it sounds bad, but I don't think it really is. I've been seeing him for a while. But that's not the point." She stepped closer, her eyes shining with a childlike frivolity, as if confessing something both embarrassing and thrilling. "The point is, I didn't plan this. I mean, it's Roger. He's Roger. You know how he is. He wanted me, and, well, I couldn't say no to him. He's so persuasive, you know. Once he decides he wants something, he gets it." She let out a quiet, almost inaudible laugh. "And he wanted me." Blake stared at her, his mind struggling to process her words. She spoke about Roger as if he were a force of nature, something inevitable. And her tone, was there pride in it? It felt surreal. Her words echoed in his head, empty and strange. It seemed as though Blake couldn't make sense of it all. "But that's why I'm telling you," she continued, her voice taking on a more serious tone. "I didn't want to hide it from you anymore. I feel so much better just telling you, you know. No more secrets. It's like a weight has been lifted off my shoulders. And I didn't want to lie about the trip." She gestured to the suitcase. "Roger and I are leaving for a week. He thinks it will be good for us to truly enjoy each other without having to hide, you know. Just to be together." Blake opened his mouth but couldn't utter a word. His thoughts swirled like a storm, and his emotions began to boil. He couldn't comprehend it, couldn't grasp the reality of the situation. How could Susan stand there, so excited, so casual, talking about something that had shattered the very foundation of their marriage? "Don't worry," Susan quickly added, her face lighting up again. "It's only for a week. After that, we'll go back to normal life. I'll come back to you, Blake. I love you. There's no reason for this to come between us. This," she waved her hands dismissively, as if brushing off the entire situation, "is just a coincidence. A little hiccup. Roger just wanted me. And now, once he's had me, we'll be gone for only a week, and then I'll return. Then we can really focus on us, on building our family. Blake's heart pounded heavily in his chest. A ringing filled his ears. How could she be so cheerful, so bright and happy? She spoke of her infidelity as if it meant nothing. As if Blake himself meant nothing. The way she talked about Roger, as if he were some kind of important figure, made no sense. Susan was clearly infatuated with Roger. She had simply resigned herself to it, because, what else could she do? It was Roger. I know this might come as a shock, but you've always been so understanding, Blake. That's one of the reasons I love you. You're balanced. You never make a fuss, and that's why I know we'll get through this. She stepped closer, holding out a folded piece of paper. Roger and I talked about it. Just to make sure everything goes smoothly, you know. We wrote something down, a guide for you. Blake stared at the piece of paper in her hand, his mind numb. Susan held the list out to him. It's really nothing special. Just a few guidelines to make sure everything goes smoothly while I'm gone. His hands trembled as he unfolded the paper. Some of the phrases were stark and clear. 1. No arguments before or after the trip. We all want to keep things peaceful. 2. Don't tell anyone about what we're doing. 3. No posts on social media about any of this. 4. No discussions about divorce or living separately. This is just a fling. 5. Don't ask about the details of the trip afterward. 6. Calmly wait at home until the trip is over, then focus on the future. Family plans should remain as discussed previously. Blake felt his breath catch. No arguments. Don't tell anyone. No divorce. He couldn't stomach such audacity. The assumption that he would simply comply while his wife spent a week with another man was beyond outrageous. The sheer arrogance of these two betrayers was both astounding and naive. Susan's voice broke his silence. See? Nothing unusual. Just a few simple things to make sure everything goes smoothly. Roger thinks very highly of you, you know. He said you'd handle it just fine. This might be hard, but it'll all be over soon, and we'll go back to the way things were. You're not the jealous type, Blake. You're practical. I know this is difficult, but everything will be fine. You're not going to make a big deal out of nothing, right? Her wide eyes were filled with hope, almost pleading. But beneath that hope lay a certainty, an absolute belief that everything would be fine because, of course, Blake wouldn't make a fuss. Of course, he wouldn't argue. He was her rock. Divorce was unthinkable. Not in her world. Blake's hands clenched the list. His mind screamed at him to say something, anything. But he had no words. What could he possibly say? Susan smiled, mistaking his silence for agreement. I knew you'd understand, she said softly, relief washing over her face. I was so nervous, but you've always given me what I needed. You've always been there for me, and you always will be. She leaned in and quickly pecked him on the cheek. I'll be back next Friday afternoon, she said, grabbing her suitcase and bouncing cheerfully. Then everything will go back to normal, and we can talk about starting a family. Okay. Blake watched as she walked out the door, pausing to turn back with a radiant smile, as though everything in the world was perfectly fine. Then she was gone. Blake stood there, clutching the folded list in his fist. It was almost laughable. A guide. As if his actions were something they could control. Something they could dictate and manage with a few simple rules. As if it wasn't his marriage they had trampled on. For a moment, he stood frozen, his mind still reeling. But then something began to burn inside him. A fire ignited, and it wasn't confusion or a broken heart. It was rage, and it was growing. Blake had always been adept at fixing things. When the situation called for it, he could be a negotiator, solving any problem. If firm action was required, he took it without hesitation. He could do whatever the situation demanded once he determined what needed to be done. What he was feeling now was familiar, a problem requiring a particular approach. But it wouldn't be the kind Roger and Susan would appreciate. He looked over the list again. The audacity, the arrogance. To think they had even the slightest hope of keeping him under control. It was foolish to seriously believe he would follow their instructions and play the role they'd assigned him. Susan thought everything would go back to normal when she returned. He could almost hear Roger's voice, laying out conditions as if this were some kind of game. Blake read through the list once more and began to smile. For Susan and Roger, this was about limitations, boundaries, making sure no complications arose. It was all about how they managed him, how they kept him in check. Blake had a different perspective. The list made it clear what they were worried about, what they feared, and what they thought he might do. In his hands, this wasn't a contract. It was a spark. A beginning. If they were going to give him a list, well, he could come up with something better. Far better. A grim, wicked smile spread across his face as the pieces began to fall into place. His mind sharpened. Blake wasn't one to yell or throw things in anger. No, his fury was never loud. Blake's anger was quiet, calculated. He had built his career solving problems, and this betrayal, was the biggest problem he had ever faced. How do you solve big problems? Step by step. Their list was too short and far too naive. It didn't even cover half of what needed to be done. Blake would create a much more thorough plan. He walked into the kitchen, tossed their pathetic list onto the table, yanked open a drawer, and pulled out a notebook and pen. He was in the zone now. His mind was firing on all cylinders. He knew how to solve problems. It was time to tackle the issue of his unfaithful wife and her conniving boss. He would resolve this just as he resolved everything else, by staying 10 steps ahead. His new list wouldn't be pleasant. It wouldn't be short. Blake's new to-do list. 1. Freeze all joint accounts. Blake managed all the accounts. He had always taken care of the finances. He wasn't cruel, but he wouldn't make things easy for her. All automatic payments, deposits, or shared accounts would be shut down. Her money would remain untouched, but his would be entirely off limits to her. 2. Change the locks. When she returned, her key wouldn't work anymore. This house, their home, no longer belonged to her. She had made her choice, and if she needed a place to stay, she could knock on Roger's door. She would find nothing for herself here. 3. Sell the house. There were too many memories, and none of them were worth preserving. He would put the house on the market while she was away and never look back. By the time Susan returned, the house would no longer be his problem, just like she wouldn't be. 4. Pack up her belongings. All of Susan's things would go into storage. Blake would, of course, pack them carefully and leave them for her to collect later. Clothes, trinkets, photos, everything that tied her to him would be boxed up and put away. He'd even arranged to send all their shared furniture with her. He was starting a new life somewhere else. He didn't need reminders. 5. Gather evidence. Susan had taken her phone with her, but Blake had handled all her tech needs. He would buy a new phone for her number and restore it using Susan's cloud account. All her messages, emails, and photos would be in his hands. The phone she used to contact him would stop working, but she could sort that out when she returned. 6. Speak with an attorney. Divorce wasn't up for negotiation. It was a foregone conclusion. Blake would hire the best lawyer in town and start the paperwork. No separation or divorce. Be realistic. 7. Talk to Roger's wife. They expected Blake to stay silent and maintain peace. But why should he? Maybe Roger was used to calling the shots, but Blake had no incentive to cooperate. He'd make sure to share all the evidence he anticipated finding, now that he knew where to start looking. 8. Focus on the future. Because this wasn't the end of Blake's life. It was simply the end of Susan's place in it. He would leave town and start fresh somewhere new. He wouldn't waste his time on bitterness. For now, his focus was on this list. Blake leaned back, tapping his pen against the paper. Planning felt good. He wasn't going to beg. He wasn't going to fight for something already broken. No, he was taking control in a way neither Susan nor Roger could have anticipated. He was reclaiming his life from people who thought they could use it as they pleased. That he had his plan. By the time Susan returned, the world she thought she knew would already be gone. Blake stood in the middle of the empty living room. The house was now bare. Everything had been cleared out, not just Susan's belongings, but everything. Her clothes, shoes, even the little trinkets were packed up and neatly stored in one of 2 storage units outside. His own belongings were in the other unit, ready for whatever came next. His buddies had helped him move it all, asking no questions. By now, they all knew the story, but they kept their noses out of it. They just did what needed to be done in exchange for pizza and beer. That had been the easy part. Physical labor always came naturally to Blake. Sweat, muscle, determination, he could handle that. The hardest part was keeping his mind clear. Over the past few days, he had experienced a whirlwind of emotions. Betrayal, rage, disbelief, they all simmered just beneath the surface. He was wound up, waiting for the inevitable explosion. But he couldn't let it happen. Not yet. Blake took one final look around the house. It was no longer a home, just an empty shell. The walls seemed thinner, the air colder. The house had been scrubbed clean, every trace of their shared life erased. He would never set foot here again, and that thought felt right. Everything had been tainted. And then there was the title. That sweet irony, it was his house. The house they had never bothered to put her name on. Susan had lived here, played here, but it had never been hers. He chuckled bitterly. She probably never even thought about it, just assumed she and Blake would stay there forever. She was wrong. His lawyer was efficient and prepared the divorce papers with precision. No long conversations, no drama. Blake wasn't going to drag this out. The documents were finalized and ready to be filed the moment she returned. If she returned. He no longer cared. Whether she came back to the sold house or stayed with Roger forever didn't matter anymore. The most effort had gone into Susan's phone. Of course, she had taken it with her when she and Roger left. But Susan had always been careless with her passwords and trusted Blake completely. And why wouldn't she? He had been loyal to her, an unwavering rock she had taken for granted. He sat at the kitchen table, staring coldly and intently at the restored phone in his hand. It looked exactly like her phone, because it was. He had remotely deactivated her service, replaced the phone, and restored everything from her cloud backup. It had been almost too easy. And he found everything he needed. Her messages with Roger were revolting. It wasn't just the affair itself, which Blake had prepared himself for, but the way they spoke about him. Roger, ever the smug one, dismissively brushed off Blake as no threat. He's too nice. He'll put up with it. Blake could almost hear the arrogance in the typed words. Susan's responses cut even deeper. It'll be fine. He won't make a fuss. He never does. He felt bile rise in his throat but swallowed it down. He won't make a fuss. That's how she saw him. Not as a partner, not as a man she respected, but as a doormat. A man too weak to stand up for himself. And then there were the photos. Of course, there were photos. Apparently, Roger enjoyed capturing moments of Susan pleasing him and then sending them to her. Blake found himself wondering what kind of person could do something like that. Roger had even sent her an email confirming their trip, gloating over how clever he was. Blake's lips curled in contempt. They were careless, arrogant, and they thought they were untouchable. All of it, taken together, formed a perfect exposé: the messages, the photos, the undeniable evidence of their affair. Everything was documented, neatly organized, and shared publicly. Not just with his divorce lawyer, but also with Roger's wife. Additionally, it was sent to the board of directors under whom Roger worked, and a slightly edited version was posted on social media. Blake ensured it wouldn't be flagged for nudity, but it was damning enough to expose the truth. He had gone to great lengths to make sure everyone who knew Susan or Roger got the news. Blake meticulously handled the matter of Roger's wife. This wasn't about revenge, not entirely, but the woman deserved to know. She had a right to the truth, just as he did. And, surprisingly, she accepted it, perhaps too graciously. The silence on the other end of the line unsettled him, but he pushed that aside. He had done his part. He shared everything he'd uncovered with her via email. Whatever happened next was up to her and her sleazebag husband. Blake wanted them left with nothing. Susan thought she could return to her life, to Blake, and their plans for a family. Roger thought he could walk away unscathed, as if none of this would touch him. Blake wasn't going to let that happen. Susan was nervous, yet exhilarated, as the trip began. Roger had planned everything: first-class flights to Italy, a luxurious hotel suite, and dinners at the finest restaurants. He had swept her off her feet with his grandeur. For a while, it was intoxicating. To be desired by a man like Roger. A man who commanded every room he entered, made her feel special, as though she were part of something much greater. Roger wanted her, and that meant something, didn't it? On the first night, they checked into the hotel, and everything seemed perfect. Roger had arranged for champagne to be waiting for them in the room, and they laughed, clinked glasses, and spent the evening in bed. The view of the city lights through the massive windows was breathtaking. Susan let herself be swept up in the charm and romance of it all. By the second day, things started to change. At first, it was subtle. Roger was still attentive but seemed somewhat distant. There was a look in his eyes that suggested the novelty of their getaway was already wearing off for him. Susan laughed at something he said over cocktails, but Roger didn't laugh back. Instead, he gave her a thin, dismissive smile, the kind she had seen him use with employees he considered beneath him. She didn't say anything. Maybe he was tired or distracted by something else. Susan had left her phone on the nightstand, using it to charge the small clock she had brought along. She didn't try to call or message Blake. She missed him, but she felt he wouldn't want to talk to her while she was with Roger. Still, she felt a twinge of irritation that Blake hadn't sent even a single message to check on her. It didn't matter. Roger demanded all her attention while she was with him. The next day, Roger took her shopping at several designer boutiques, exclusive stores she had always dreamed of visiting but had never dared to enter. Roger fit in effortlessly. That evening, he bought her a dress for dinner. For a moment, she felt like she was living in a fairy tale, as if they were leading a glamorous secret life. But as the evening wore on, Roger became increasingly distant. He spent most of dinner checking his phone, occasionally nodding when she spoke but never truly engaging. The waitresses fawned over him, and Susan found herself retreating into his shadow, feeling more like an accomplice than a partner. That night, when they lay in bed, Roger fell asleep almost immediately, turning his back to her. Susan turned to her phone, feeling a strange mix of guilt and longing. Blake hadn't called or sent a single message. She wasn't sure if that was a relief or a disappointment. By the fourth day, Roger had almost completely lost interest in her outside of the bedroom. He still paraded her around at lunches, introducing her to colleagues or acquaintances as if she were some kind of trophy. Suddenly, she realized there had never been any warmth between them. To him, she had always been just a toy. Another pretty face to show off. Another notch on the bedpost. He barely spoke to her except during meals, and when they were in the hotel room, he either used her or ignored her entirely. At some point, he brought two other women to the room. He barely glanced at Susan when they walked in. She was stunned, but Roger hardly noticed her discomfort. He told her that if she wasn't going to join the three of them in bed, she could sleep on the couch. That was when the full weight of the situation finally hit her. She spent the night curled up on the couch, staring at the ceiling, trying to figure out where it had all gone wrong. This wasn't what she had imagined. Roger had wanted her. He had chosen her. But now she felt like nothing more than part of the decor. Disposable. The next morning, Susan tried to talk to him. She wanted to share her feelings, to ask if everything was okay, and if there was something she could do. But he brushed her off coldly. "Don't be dramatic, Susan. This trip is just for fun," he said. She forced a weak smile and nodded, but something inside her broke. This wasn't fun. It wasn't exciting anymore. She missed Blake and the stability of her real life. Blake had looked at her like she was the center of his world. With Roger, she felt like nothing more than a side character. On the 6th day, things got truly bad. He didn't like her, not really. What mattered to him was how she looked in his arms, the thrill of sex, and the power he had over her. But Susan herself was nothing more than another thing for him to use. In that moment, she realized how foolish she had been to think this week would be magical or meaningful. She was just a toy to this man. On the final evening, Susan reached for her phone. She wanted to call Blake and check on him. But when she looked at her phone, she realized something was off. The battery was fully charged, but there was no signal, no notifications. She hadn't received a single message from Blake. No missed calls, no texts. She had assumed Blake would wait for her, that he would understand, and everything would be fine when she returned home. Now, she wasn't so sure. Why hadn't he called? Not even once. She tried calling him from the hotel phone, but for some reason, the call wouldn't connect to Blake's number. The journey back brought Susan a sense of relief. She couldn't wait to leave. The luxury, the glamour, it all felt so fake and hollow. The shine had worn off, and all she wanted was to go home. She missed Blake. She missed his warmth, his kindness, his stability. She missed how safe she had always felt with him. With a heavy heart, Susan stared out the airplane window as the plane descended. She felt ashamed and confused by how deeply she had allowed herself to sink into Roger's world. Now the fantasy had shattered into pieces, leaving only a sense of emptiness. Roger was nothing more than a selfish, cold man who had used her. Susan realized that now she understood what it felt like to be utterly degraded. She had become one for Roger. She began to cry quietly. All she wanted was to be back in Blake's arms, back where everything made sense. She wanted to tell Blake how much she had missed him. She imagined returning home, falling to her knees, and begging for forgiveness. He would forgive her. He always did. He had to. Susan pulled over at the curb in front of her house. Her heart was pounding wildly with excitement and fear. The trip had been a mistake, and she finally understood that. Roger wasn't the man she had thought he was, and everything that had happened over the past week felt like a bad dream. But it was all behind her now. All she could think about was seeing Blake, falling into his arms, and telling him how sorry she was. She would explain everything. They would talk, and then they would move on. They would start over. But when she stepped out of the car, she saw a bright, bold "For Sale" sign on the lawn in front of the house. Her stomach churned. For sale. That couldn't be right. Blake hadn't mentioned anything about selling the house. Why would he do that? They had plans. Sure, there were problems to work through, but they could fix them. This had to be some kind of mistake. Already unsettled by the sign, she fumbled for her keys. The key fit into the lock but wouldn't turn. Confused, she tried again. It wouldn't budge. She jiggled it, pulled it out, and reinserted it, but still, nothing happened. Why wasn't it working? Blake, she called out, knocking on the door with growing urgency. Blake, are you there? It's me. There was no response. Her voice echoed faintly beyond the door. Susan's heart flipped as she moved to the window and peered inside. The house was empty. Completely empty. No furniture. No pictures. No sign that anyone had ever lived there. Blake, she whispered. This wasn't just some big misunderstanding. Something was wrong. She reached for her phone and dialed Blake's number. The screen lit up, but something was off. Her phone wouldn't connect. An error message flashed on the screen, no service. Susan was stunned. She scrolled through the settings to check the signal. Nothing. It was as if her phone had been disconnected. She tried calling her parents next, but the same error appeared. She couldn't reach anyone. What the hell? She got back into her car, her hands trembling as she started the engine. Blake will explain everything, she thought. He wouldn't just leave like this. The drive to her parents' house passed in a fog as she desperately tried to come up with a scenario where Blake could fix everything. Maybe there had been a mix-up with the house. Maybe Blake had gone to work and forgotten to tell her. Maybe. When she pulled up to her parents' house, she barely had time to turn off the engine before rushing to the front door. Her mother opened it before she could knock, her face tense with worry. Susan, her mother said in a tense voice, where have you been? We've been trying to reach you. Susan swallowed hard. Something's wrong with my phone. I couldn't call anyone. What's going on, Mom? Blake, he changed the locks. The house is empty. What's happening? Her mother let out a heavy sigh and stepped aside, gesturing for Susan to come inside. You'd better sit down. I don't want to sit down. I want to know what's going on. Susan's voice wavered, panic seeping into her tone. Why can't I reach Blake? Why is our house up for sale? Her father entered the room, a quiet sadness etched across his face. Blake is gone, Susan. He's left town. The house is on the market. Your things are in storage. The words hit her like a sledgehammer to the chest, and suddenly, it was hard to breathe. 1. Her mind struggled to grasp what she was hearing. Blake is gone. He put the house up for sale. Why hadn't he told her? Why hadn't he called? What do you mean, he's gone? Susan's voice trembled, her heartbeat pounding in her ears. He wouldn't just leave me like that. He wouldn't leave. He loves me. Her parents exchanged glances, a look that only deepened her growing sense of dread. Her mother sat down beside her and gently placed a hand on her shoulder. Susan, he's not coming back. Blake called us a couple of days ago. He said you left with someone else and that it's over. He's put your things in storage, the house is up for sale, and he's filed for divorce. Susan blinked, struggling to process what she was hearing. This couldn't be real. Divorce? No. Blake wouldn't do that. He couldn't. He loved her. They were supposed to fix this. She had made a mistake, but they could work through it. He just couldn't do this. He said it's over, she asked, her voice dropping to almost a whisper. Just like that? Her father nodded solemnly. He said you knew what you were doing when you left with that man. That it was your choice. And now, this is his choice. Susan stared at him. She had assumed Blake would wait for her, as he always had, with his characteristic calm. No matter what she did, he would be there, steady, patient, ready to take her back. But now he was gone. And it was her fault. She buried her face in her hands, hot tears streaming down her cheeks. I didn't want this to happen, she choked out. I didn't want this. He wasn't supposed to leave. I thought. You thought Blake would just forgive you, her mother said softly, though without hostility. But Susan, you hurt him. How could you do that to him? Her sobs grew heavier, and Susan shook her head, overwhelmed by disbelief and regret. Blake had been her rock, her foundation. But she had taken him for granted, believing he would love her no matter what. She thought she could play with fire and not get burned. Now, she stood in the ashes of her ruined life. Have you tried calling him? Her father asked quietly. Susan nodded, her hands still covering her face. I can't get through. I think he must have changed his number. I can't reach him. Her mother nodded solemnly. He's done, Susan. He didn't want to have any more contact with us either. Susan shot to her feet and began pacing the room frantically. No, 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 no. This can't be happening. I need to talk to him. He'll understand. He has to understand. But as the words left her mouth, the reality finally began to sink in. Blake was gone. Truly gone. And there was nothing she could say or do to fix it. She sank back into the chair, her hands trembling. I never thought it would end like this, she whispered, more to herself than to her parents. I never thought, but deep down, she knew. She had let Roger take her away. She had allowed herself to believe it was forgivable, that Blake would be there, waiting for her to come to her senses. She had gambled everything, believing she couldn't lose. And now, it was dawning on her that she had lost. Her phone lay on the coffee table, dead and disconnected, much like her life felt now. The house was gone, her husband was gone, and the future with Blake she had once dreamed of had vanished.